Okay, so she gave me the high sign. Okay, welcome. Everyone, welcome. My name is Philip Young, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm the CEO, President of World Affairs. As background, I came here a little over, what was it, Jonathan, 2 years ago, right? I had huge plans for this organization. And then something happened. I wonder what that is, COVID. And then suddenly we're shut down for 2 years. And I have to tell you, I'm excited for two reasons, really excited. One, you all are participating in the first public event in this building in 2 years. So give yourself a hand. Really, that is huge, okay? The second reason I'm excited and the staff is excited is because this marks the emergence, the reemergence of world affairs, and what I hope is going to be something new. I've been talking about something new for the last 2 years, and now we finally have the chance to actually start implementing this. And so we're going to start a tradition here right now, okay? I tried this before. I think I must have been a couple weeks into being at World Affairs, and then it just sort of melted away. I want all of you to take 30 seconds, and I know everyone here is going, no, you only have 2 minutes to speak, but I never stay within time. I want you to take 30 seconds and greet someone and introduce yourself to someone you haven't met. Okay, you have 30 seconds right now, okay? So I will speak above you. You have 10 seconds. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Quiet, 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 quiet. Okay, so I want you to remember who you met, because you are going to see them again, all right? And again. And you know, the way things work, as you get to my age, the more and more you see someone, the more familiar you get, and then suddenly we become friends, we become a community, and that's what this is all about. So I can talk all about the new plans and our programs, and I can list them for you. I'm not going to do that. Instead, what I thought I would do is tell you a very short story, because I'm big on stories. And if my wife told me that I was going to tell a story involving her, she'd kill me, and I'm glad she's not here, okay? But here's the story, okay? My wife, Melissa, and I were listening to a radio program. Not our radio program, but we were listening to a radio program during the terrible, awful, chaotic withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan. It was a gut-wrenching story. And so, you know, just things that we hadn't heard and seen before. It was just awful. And what was really took me by surprise is that Melissa suddenly turned off the radio. And I'm going, why did you do that? I mean, you know, here's my wife who's, you know, worked in Washington, D.C. She's into public affairs. She wants to, you know, she is conscious about what's going on in the world, and she didn't want to hear it. I said, what's going on, right? She told me that as gut-wrenching, as awful as it was, and it was terrible, she was sick and tired of hearing all this because she couldn't take it anymore. She said that, I can't do anything about this, so I don't want to hear it, all right? So that made me, that sort of ticked a light off in my head, you know, kind of a light bulb. And for those of you, it took me a long time, but I always listen to my spouse now, right? I really do. My wife has the most incredible insight, okay? Spouses, you got a very slow learner, right? And what it was the insight that we have a messy world. It's really, really messy right now, right? But we all want to do something. That's why you're here. Whether you realize it or not, you want to do something about it. And so the insight that we came about was that, how did I write it down? We know you want to take action. And we at World Affairs, the new World Affairs, want to help you find the way to do that. Okay, that's what we're going to do. Before, we were simply giving you insight and information. In this new world, that is not enough. So what did we do? So interestingly, we ended up running a amazing radio podcasts on our program. And what happened at the end of that program was an experiment for us. And the experiment was, and this ran on Monday, and it said, we're having a town hall. If you want to do something, this is to our radio audience, come to our town hall on Tuesday, the next day. Now, our staff had done a lot of work. We had lined up a lot of people to help with the refugees because they were coming in as we speak, as the program was running, right? So we did that, and lo and behold, the next day, virtually, we had 125 people on this virtual town hall meeting. And it wasn't about just raising money. The town hall and the panels that we had lined up were talking about the help they needed, which was not just money, it was translation services. It was getting people there to sort all the materials that we're getting. It was a way for us and our community, where the Afghan American community is huge here, to do something and do something meaningful. So with that as an illustration of what our aspirations are and what we are going to do, I want to tell you this byline that we're experimenting with. So you're the first to hear this, okay? And so our promise to all of you, your members, who you are, and if you're not, please join. Our promise to you is that World Affairs is going to be the place where change, the change we wish to see in the world, it starts here, okay? And it's where global learning becomes personal action and leads to something even bigger. So please think about that, and please join us. And so right now, I can think of nothing better than this amazing panel and the guests that we have here to start off our kickoff reemergence in 2022. Our guests are going to show how individual dedication, commitment, and action can make a difference. And we're going to talk, I think, a little bit later about what more we can do. So I am so pleased to introduce Lily Jamali. You know her well. I've heard her, part of California Report, and also on Marketplace. This is the first time I met her, and it's just a delight. And I want to thank you for joining us, and I want to thank you for helping us start our reemergence into the new world. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Philip, for that very wonderful introduction. Thanks to everybody for coming here in person. Isn't it weird but wonderful to be in a room together? And I also want to acknowledge our audience on Zoom. We have a lot of people joining us remotely. And so for folks on Zoom and for all of you, there is going to be an opportunity to ask our amazing panelists questions towards the end of the discussion. So if you're here, there's cards that were on your seats before you took your seats. So you can fill those out, and there will be someone by the name of Megan going around to collect them, and we will try to ask as many of them as we can. She's right back there in the corner. And if you are joining us by Zoom, you can also use the Q&A function on Zoom to ask us your questions. So thrilled to have the brothers Rezaian, here on the stage with me, and we will also be joined later by Ambassador Roger Carstens. As many of you know, Jason is an opinion columnist for The Washington Post. He was the Post's Tehran correspondent in 2014 when he was arrested and falsely accused by Iran of being an American spy. At the time, the US and Iran were negotiating the Iran nuclear deal, and Jason ended up spending 18 months in Tehran's Evin prison. Since his release, he's focused on promoting democracy around the world, promoting press freedom, and he's also used his platform to advocate for hostages taken prisoner by foreign governments. He is the author of Prisoner, the memoir, as well as the host of the new podcast, 544 Days. We're also joined by Jason's brother, Ali. Ali played a central role in the campaign to get Jason out of prison. During Jason's captivity, Ali was spokesman for the Rezaian family. He made countless appearances on global media networks to spark interest in his brother's situation, and he created a change.org petition that some of you may have signed, some of you in the audience. It got 500,000 signatures in 140 countries. Not bad for a guy who's a biotech consultant by day. And as we'll hear tonight, Jason is convinced, I think we can say, that Ali really played an instrumental role in ensuring that he's with us here today. So please give them a warm welcome, if you would. All right. So, Jason, let's start with you. Set the scene for us. Okay, it's 2009, and you have this dream of becoming a foreign correspondent. That's a thing you can do in many different countries, but you chose to do so in Iran. Tell us about that.
I think I got to wind back just a little bit. First of all, thanks everybody for coming out tonight. It means a lot to me and to us. Thank you, Lily, for making the time. Ambassador Carstens for coming out. My big brother Ollie for continuing to support me, and for World Fairs for doing this. It's really wonderful. I'm a local kid. I was born in San Francisco, grew up in Marin County. Our mom was from Illinois, and our dad came from Iran. He came to the U.S. in 1959 to go to college. He and my mom met as students at San Francisco State. They claim in the library. It's a fact that I can't fact check. Our dad's no longer with us, unfortunately. But he came here in 1959 at a time when there were more Iranians studying in the U.S. as exchange students than students from any other country in the world, right? That's not a fact that most people are aware of. And the politics between the U.S. and Iran were friendly until 1979, when the embassy was stormed and American hostages were taken and held for 444 days. I never thought I would lap those guys by 100, but that's what happened. I was always really interested in traveling. I traveled a lot in my later teens and early 20s, and had the opportunity to go to Iran when I was 25. I had just graduated from college, knew that I wanted to be a journalist. Also knew that it's not easy to get into journalism, especially if you have a specific thing that you want to do, like covering a country on the other side of the world that doesn't really welcome journalists. But I would take a couple of trips each year to Iran and write some stories, and then try and sell them when I came back. And over a period of time, I built a small body of work. In 2008, to augment those trips that I would take to Iran, I'd work in my dad's Persian rug shop. It was in Petaluma. Some of you might be familiar with his original rug shop, which was in Mill Valley, on the road out to Stinson Beach, kind of dome that's been there. Probably said to yourself, those guys have been going out of business for... we haven't been there since 1985, right?
Yeah, Dad went out of business there in 1985.
Dad went out of business in 1985. We don't know about anybody since then, but he was in Petaluma for a long time. And then in 2008, I opened a rug shop literally 2 blocks from where we are right now, at Sutter and Powell, 527 Sutter Street. It's a 7-Eleven right now. I opened in May of 2008. You guys remember that year pretty well. By October, I was bailing a lot of water and paying a very high Union Square rent.
In the middle of the financial crisis.
In the middle of the financial crisis. Not a lot of Persian rugs being sold in 2008 and early 2009. So when I closed my doors in May of 2009, I had a choice, you know, stay around here with horrible credit and no career options, or move to Iran and finally make a go of it.
Yeah.
And that's what I did. And I was never out of journalistic work until the day I was arrested.
Mm-hmm. And what were your impressions of the place? You and I are not that far apart in age. We both grew up as Iranian Americans in the U.S. in the 80s.
Yeah.
Not the best decade to be an Iranian American kid in the U.S. I think we can agree that was an uncomfortable time at times. But while we're being barraged by these awful stories coming out of Iran, you're in this loving, warm household. You're experiencing Iran through the culture, through the food. How do you reconcile those two very disparate images of Iran?
I mean, I think that was the essential conflict for me that as a journalist I wanted to explore. What is this place really like? It's very different than the representations of it that we see in newspapers. That's not to say that the regime in Iran is any less brutal or authoritarian than it's portrayed.
Yeah.
But oh, by the way, it's a nation of 85 million people that are very different than the government. A lot of people, the majority of people, I don't think ever really supported this form of government that they've been living under for 43 years now. So it was that tension and conflict that I really wanted to go and uncover and take this place and people that feel so distant from our experience here in the Bay Area or in the greater United States, and make it a little bit more touchable.
Those were the kinds of stories that you wanted to tell.
That's the stories I wanted to tell.
And that you did end up telling.
I told a lot of those stories. Ultimately, I became very good, I think, at telling those stories, good enough that the Washington Post hired me to be their correspondent and bureau chief there, which meant that I had to cover other stories as well that, were more about the day-to-day politics. But I was always able to infuse that with stories of real life as well.
And then the arrest happens.
Yeah. Yeah, so I had just been covering a round of the nuclear negotiations in Vienna. This was in July of 2014. They kind of came to an interim agreement that they would extend the period of time of negotiations. It seemed as though the writing was on the wall that there would be a deal with Iran over its nuclear program. I returned to Tehran to pack a bag and pick up my wife. We were going to fly back here to California and spend a couple of months on break. We rented an Airbnb down the street from Ollie and Naomi. I was home for about 36 hours. We were preparing to go to a surprise birthday party for my mother, and we left our apartment. And in the basement garage of our apartment, there were 3 plainclothes security agents with guns pointed right at me. They took us back into our apartment, ransacked it, took our devices, our identity information, cards, passports, blindfold, cuffed us, and took us off to prison, where I'd spent the next year and a half.
Ali, I want to bring you into the conversation. How did you find out that Jason had been arrested? And what is the first thing that goes through your mind when you find out that your little brother has just been taken hostage by a foreign government?
That's the first thing.
So I got this call. I kept on getting these phone calls from an unlisted number on that day. And I didn't know what it was. I was taking the day off, and I just said, I don't want to deal with this. I'm with my son and dealing with stuff around the house. Then I got this text that said, hi, this is Doug Gell. I'm Jason's boss at the Washington Post. We should probably talk. So I called him up, and we spoke for a few minutes. He told me that essentially what Jason had told me, or I just mentioned, that he'd been taken. They didn't know who at the time because there was nobody doing a color commentary, right? All they knew was Jason wasn't there. His house had been ransacked. Nobody knew where he was because somebody who we knew had contacted Doug, and so that was the first thing we heard. I think, kind of after the initial shock, right, of saying, hey, this is kind of unreal. I knew that Jason had been questioned before. I knew that reporters in Iran oftentimes were taken by the government for short periods of time and asked questions. That didn't usually come with ransacking their house. Mm-hmm. But I think that the first thing that you think is, okay, some of this kind of stuff happens, and you hope that this is going to blow over.
Did you think early on that it would blow over quickly?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think.
So did I.
Yeah, everybody did. I mean, so when talking with the Post, and I think kind of first next steps was thinking about how we were going to tell my mom, And the Washington Post was in contact with some folks to kind of try and figure out what was going on. So Doug and I decided we were going to talk in a few hours. I told him I would contact my mother. But absolutely, to answer your other question, for a very long time, as I was actually speaking with Roger about in the green room, we had no idea it was going to go this long. There's no way we could look at the situation and say, hey, this is going to go this far. If you look at any other hostages or any other journalists who had been taken in Iran, nobody had ever been held longer than, I think, 110 days before that.
And Jason, one of the most striking things about hearing your story in the book and on the podcast is how little information you had, especially early on, about what was happening to you, and also what the world knew, how the story was being reported. What did your interrogators tell you?
So, this is an act of psychological terror, torture, and warfare inflicted on an individual that starts that very first moment. I mean, you are deposited in solitary confinement. I spent 49 days in solitary in a cell that was 8 feet by 4 feet, long enough to lay down one way and not the other, with bright fluorescent lights on 24 hours a day. And the only time I was let out of the cell was to be taken for interrogation, and that would last many hours. And in those early interrogations, it was a battle of wills, because you're still relatively strong, right? But you are also very confused. And my captors told me initially that they had surfaced, they'd put out reports that my wife and I had died in a car accident, and everybody had believed that, and that the Washington Post wasn't doing anything, and that my mom was very sad, but she got over it. I mean, like, all of this kind of stuff that, you think to yourself, that can't be true. And then on day 4, and then day 5 turns into week 2, turns into week 3, and nothing is changing.
Yeah.
You start to wonder, does anybody know? Does anybody care? Is anybody doing anything? And you have to hold on hope. You have to hold on to hope that people are, and that always starts with a family. Ollie and I have talked to lots of different families over the last 5-6 years since I got out. Ambassador Carstens and Carol Lee, who work on this on a day-to-day basis, talk with families all the time. The first thing that goes through a family's head is, do we say anything or don't we? There's people telling you to keep your mouth shut. And,
That's something that Ellie and your family grappled with very much. Ellie, in 2015, just to give people a sense, because Jason outlines this, extensively in the book, you made 20 trips to D.C. that year, 200 nights away from home that year. You're on the phone with journalists, diplomats, arms dealers. Anybody you can get information out of.
Is that true?
But this issue of how public to go was something that you had to grapple with early on. How did you make that decision?
I think there's a lot of people giving you a lot of advice early on, and this is something, we've talked a lot about with family members as well as with folks in the government. People are saying, keep it quiet. If you give them a way out, this is specifically about Iran, they'll let him go. He's much more likely to get out if you don't make a big deal out of it. I'll say this was a decision that was made for me because it was news, right? So, working with the Washington Post, first thing is when working with the government says, State Department says, sign this waiver if you want us to be able to mention your family member's name, right? Because otherwise they won't even talk about it to anybody. So there's some breaks on it there. But, this was news, Jason being taken and being arrested. And I think it's probably fair to say that Jason knew all the Western journalists in Iran at the time, and they all have, newspaper lines to fill, right? And this is a story. So we were able to work with some folks in the U.S. Who knew Jason and knew what was going on to kind of slow it down a little bit with the idea that maybe if we go 48, 72 hours, maybe they'll let him go and this will be okay. But at some point it was going to break, and so, we got ahead of it. And, it's better to get ahead of it than to let somebody else write the story.
And you also, you're looking to the U.S. government for help, but you're also pressuring the U.S. government to help. And I wonder from you, did you feel like, as you were going through this process, the government was doing as much as it could have or should have been doing?
Well, I think there's, early on, you're just thinking day to day, right? What's going on? What can you do? What can they do to get Jason out or your family member out? But this was 18 months, so I can't really answer that question to say, yeah, I thought they were doing enough or they weren't at any particular time. I think my stock answer back then was, as long as Jason's in prison, nobody's doing enough to get him out, right? That's when I'll say somebody's doing enough. But, at the end of the day, they did what they needed to do, and Jason came home along with some others.
Okay. Well, there is someone in our Zoom audience who would like to say something. Let's bring her in, if we can do that now.
Can you hear me, Lily?
I can hear you very well.
Okay. Hello, sons. It's very good to see you both. And it's official. Dad and I did meet in the library at San Francisco State. I'm very honored to be here, and I just want to take a moment to thank everyone worldwide who worked so hard on our family's behalf to get Jason out. As Ali mentioned, he had help from many, many corners and many, many journalists and all manner of people. And it means so much, and I haven't been able to thank a lot of those people, but I hope they know how much it means to all of us. And I also want to give a shout out to my two wonderful daughters-in-law, because they really supported my sons, and I knew that, and it gave me strength, and it was one less thing for me to have to worry about at that time.
Yegi
So,
and Naomi.
Naomi and Peggy, yes. Mhm.
Mary, and I just want to acknowledge there's certainly people in the audience that are among the people that you are thanking tonight. Mary, you got really involved early on in the fight to free Jason. You had experience in Iran. You had spent a lot of time there. You'd lived there with Jason. But you returned there in person to advocate for him. Were you worried about doing that, about your own safety and security?
Not really. I had been there several times, and I'd lived with Jason for 1.5 years before he and Yegi married. So I felt really comfortable being there, and I really didn't think that they would hassle an old woman, you know. So I was not worried about myself. I didn't go immediately. It was close to 5 months, I think, before I went.
How do you think this experience changed the Rezaian family?
Well, it made us famous, for starters, or infamous. And that's something that we all have to live with. It's really hard to say. You know, I'm still processing it 5 years later after his release. So I think we all grew in different ways, and I certainly changed as a person. I used to be kind of quiet, and now not so much.
Your voice. What do you guys think? I mean, how did this change your family?
Gosh. Look, I mean, I think when something like this happens, I mean, you know, it changes everything, right? But we're still here, and that's what matters to me.
Absolutely. Well, Mary Rezaian, it's such a Pleasure and a privilege to have you here. Thank you for making a surprise appearance tonight.
Thank you for letting me join you, and love you guys. Bye-bye.
Right, and with that, we're going to pause our conversation for a couple of minutes to show all of you a clip from a new film that Jason has been hard at work on as part of, in his role with the Washington Post opinion section. You're the executive producer of this film called Bring Them Home. And we're going to show a clip. So why don't you set it up for us?
Currently, there are 4 American citizens that we know of who are being, respectfully, I will say, held hostage by the government of Iran. The official term is wrongfully or unjustly detained. But in this film, we're following the efforts of one family, a DC-based family, in their efforts to bring the father-husband figure home. And yeah.
Okay, great. So we're going to watch that. And when we come back, we'll be joined by Ambassador Roger Carstens.
I always have a journal with me. Times when I don't really know what to do, writing helps me release. My world, our world, completely torn apart, and still remains completely torn apart. I look outside for hope. From time to time, there are murmurs of hope, but generally there are tears rolling down my face with no explanation at all.
Iranian authorities never let Imad leave and arrested him again just weeks after President Biden was elected on a pledge to restart diplomacy with Iran.
That is when I went to the State Department to say, my husband is an American citizen. He's being held against his will in Iran. I want you to know this because we need help. Please tell me what to do now.
A while back, we finally had the whole family coming together. We met at the State Department, and we gave them a pretty fulsome brief on what we were trying to do and what the status of Ahmad was at the time. And during that, Bahara was kind of sketching away on something, and at the very end of it, she presented us with it. It was a napkin, kind of like a napkin that we'd given her to like put underneath her water bottle, and on it she'd written a poem. I think as we all started to read it, as it got passed around, we were all kind of tearing up. It's really a description of a family in pain, trying to meet up with a government that's responsible for bringing her loved one back. It reminded us of what our duty is.
There's 3 factors that you have to balance. One is getting the human side. Nothing could be more horrible. We need to bring them home. There's a dimension which is, what do we do in order not to encourage and incentivize this kind of behavior? And the third dimension, which is there are national security interests that we need to pursue. And an Iran with a nuclear bomb would be something that would be of great danger to the region, to our security.
Since I told the State Department, I feel like, okay, now somebody who knows what to do will do what they're supposed to do to bring Ahmad home.
That was a clip from Bring Them Home, which is, again, a film executive produced by Jason Rezaian, and it will be debuting tomorrow at the Big Sky Film Festival. I'm pleased to be joined now by Ambassador Roger Carstens. Ambassador Carstens is the Biden administration's special presidential envoy for hostage affairs. That job did not exist until 2015 when it was created under the Obama administration. Ambassador Carstens took the job in the year 2020 under President Trump, and he's one of the few Trump appointees who was asked to stay on when President Biden took over. And one of the people actually who advocated for you to stay on was Jason. So hopefully we'll get to talk a little bit about that and the importance of continuity in this role. First of all, let's please give Ambassador Carstens a warm welcome.
Oh, thank you.
And right now there are 58 incidents or cases of publicly disclosed hostage and wrongful detentions around the world. That's according to the James Foley Legacy Foundation. I'm struck by the fact that there are more hostages now held by governments than are held by terrorist groups. Why do you think that is?
First off, I appreciate the chance to be here and have a chance to talk to all of you. Philip, thank you for this invitation. World Affairs. Love the fact you're wrestling with this topic, which obviously is important to me and Jason and Ali. Jason, thank you for letting me have my job a little longer. I appreciate it. I do owe him one. So great question. Anecdotally, you'd think that it's because countries like Iran, China, and Russia have figured out that this is actually something that works for them, and they're taking more people and just stacking up hostages. That might be true, and I think we need to do a little more research on that. But we're also finding is, thanks to Congress, who passed the Levinson Act in 2020, we actually have a set of criteria that allows us in the government to do a better job of defining who is a wrongful detainee. So while hostages, you might say that number might be decreasing slightly. A hostage, if I may define that, that's someone who is taken by for example, a terrorist group. So if Al-Qaeda were to take an American and hold them, that's a hostage. If a nation state takes and detains someone, we call them a wrongful detainee if they fit some of the criteria that we look at. So the bottom line is we're getting a lot better about quickly surveying the cases that are out there across the world and then determining who's actually wrongfully held and who's not. In the past, it was hit or miss. You know, a case might bubble up to the State Department, someone might send you an email, but now we almost have a more methodical process of kind of sweeping to make sure we're finding those cases that might have otherwise been lost.
So how do you prove that someone is being held hostage?
It's hard. You know, if you were to, let's say a crime was committed right outside in this town at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, isn't it hard enough, you know, based on everything we've seen in all those great TV shows to determine who was guilty of doing what when? It gets harder if it's in a country that it could be in Mali, for example, or it could be in Burma. And trying to determine what happened, you know, it can be hard. But as you keep gathering information and evidence and bringing it up, eventually you get a picture that's painted that in some cases allows you to say that this person was taken wrongfully. And sometimes it hits you right in the face. If a government actually says, oh, we have, you know, John Smith, and by the way, we want you, the United States, to give a concession, and then we'll send John Smith back, well, that person's being used as a bargaining chip, and that case definitely comes over to my neck of the woods.
Mm-hmm. What I didn't mention about your bio is that you are a former Green Beret, correct? A member of the Special Forces, and you were trained in the 1990s as part of that to engage in special rescue operations. Mm-hmm. Talk about that experience and how does it inform the work that you do now? I
would say that that experience, I at least have an understanding a little bit of what it's like to be on the other side, and that you go through training where you're put in a POW camp, and you know you spend a few days being beaten and starved for a little bit, and then going into a hostage rescue unit. You know, you always want to try to get into the minds of the both the captives and the captors, but in a way it doesn't prepare you because there's almost an unpassable wall between what I've experienced and what Jason's experienced. And that's something that no matter what, until, you know, God forbid someone's taken a hostage, you'll never really quite understand what that is. And I think it's still important to try to put yourself in their shoes. Frankly, it's important to put yourself in the captor network's shoes or the nation state that's detaining, because you may have the chance to actually negotiate. But I would say, at least as far as my Army experience, the motto of Special Forces is De Oppresso Liber, to free the oppressed. And I've always tried to keep that as something in my life that I try to align my work to. When you align your work to your personal values, it usually makes for a happy person.
There was a lot going on when this role was created, the special presidential envoy for hostage affairs. So, for one thing, the negotiations were taking place on the what became the Iran nuclear deal. Jason was being held hostage at the time. And just generally, there were more hostages being taken by foreign governments at the time. What was the thinking behind the creation of this special envoy role?
Well, I think the government recognized they weren't doing a very good job of addressing the issue. And so President Obama, as you alluded to, did a policy review. And as the result of the policy, we tried to determine where our gaps and seams are. You know, what is it that we're not doing well? What do we need to do? And as a result, they created 3 different organizations. One's the Hostage Response Group. That's at the National Security Council. And their job is to kind of convene everyone and set up the mechanism that allows senior leaders to make decisions on what to do to bring someone back. The other is the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell. It's more of an organization that's headquartered at the FBI, and its mission is really to come up with the operational ways to retrieve hostages, not wrongful detainees, but hostages. And then my organization was given the mission of conducting the diplomatic effort. So whether it's a hostage or wrongful detention, if there's going to be a diplomatic effort, our role is to kind of coordinate everything. And I think they got that part right. I think what we've done since then is we've tried to actually grow this. Back in the day, we would call those 3 organizations the hostage enterprise, the hostage recovery enterprise. I think it's become evident to us that this is a team sport, and you can't get it done unless you partner. So we are actively always trying to branch out and partner with journalists, members on Capitol Hill, NGOs, third-party intermediaries, and for sure the families. We really try to bring the families in close, partner with them, and eventually through, I guess, going through all this pain and trying to come up with these strategies, something's going to break through and we're going to get that release.
You've actually been described by the family of one person held hostage as a bit of a cowboy in a positive way. Quote, he's not a suit. That's according to Elizabeth Whelan, who is the brother of ex-Marine Paul Whelan, who is currently being held in Russia. But you have managed to cultivate the sense among a lot of the families that you also care about what's going on with their loved ones.
Oh, I do. And in fact, Carolee, my chief of staff, who's sitting right over there, we really assess and select people to come to our organization. You really can't do this job unless you're passionate about it. Now, check that out. If I were to hire someone and say, I want you to do all these tasks, you're fully competent and qualified, but I also want you to really deeply care about it. I want you to get personally involved. That's really hard in the government because in a way you really can't force people to do that. And yet I think Carolee and I have been able to recruit some of the people that are not only extremely competent, but they wear their heart in their sleeves and they want to connect with the families, they want to cry with them, they want to bond with them, because at the end of the day, this cannot be government as usual. It's got to be personal. The State Department at times can look like the State Department. It's just what you might expect. My office is more like an emergency room where things are always happening. Everyone's always trying to get things done. And I probably spend 1 to 4 hours of every day talking to family members and trying to connect with them to get their story, partner with them, and to come up with ways to solve it. A good example of the passion that we bring is right there, Joan Sinclair in the very back. Could you raise your hand? Joan, there we go, a Foreign Service officer who's worked a lot on some of our hardest and toughest cases. But if you don't bring your heart to this, if you're punching out at 5:15 to go home, SPIHA is not the place to work for you. If you hunger to bring people home and you're personally invested, then we might have a desk for you.
You mentioned the Levinson Act. So just by way of background, this was a law passed in 2020, named after Bob Levinson, who was captured in Iran in 2007. He is presumed dead. We should mention that. Talk about the framework that created in determining what a hostage is.
Sure.
Under U.S. law.
It's funny, we still don't, in a way, show everything. And the reason we do that, it's almost like you have to have some freedom to make some of your decisions within the government. But for the most part, the big way to describe it is the Levinson Act wants the Secretary of State to make that determination who's wrongfully detained.
And you report to the Secretary of
I
State.
do. I report straight to the Secretary of State. And so in doing that, we have this criteria that the Levinson Act also gave us. Picture a decision that goes between different stakeholders. SPIHA might be a stakeholder. And forgive me, Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, SPIHA. We truncated it because it's so ridiculously
Because you love
long.
acronyms in the U.S. government.
Well, the Army trained me well, I guess, right? So, but yeah, so SPIHA might get a vote. A regional office might be able to weigh in. The lawyers at state might weigh in, other groups. And eventually you try to build this consensus to determine whether they think someone's wrongful or not. And once you get enough information together, that information floats up to the Secretary. He has delegated that to the Deputy Secretary, Wendy Sherman, and she will make the hard decision on whether that case is to be determined to be wrongful or not. If it's wrongful, the case, which might be, say, an American stuck in China, for example, that file will transfer from Consular Affairs over to my office in SPIHA, and then we start working that case because we feel it's wrongful.
And you mentioned Wendy Sherman, who was the lead U.S. negotiator of the Iran nuclear deal, who is in the podcast, 544 Days, and talks about how important it was to her when those talks were going on to keep them separate. In her view, it was important to keep them separate from the talks about Jason being freed. Why was it important? Do you agree with the importance of keeping those types of negotiations on separate tracks?
I'd say for the most part, if I had to quickly make a decision, I would try to cleave that apart and separate it.
Why is that?
Well, so, for example, if I want to go to a country that the United States does not have very good relations with, in fact, let's say we have no diplomatic relations. We pulled our embassy because our relationships are so fractured. If I want to go down and talk to someone in that country, I want to make it clear that I'm there to talk about hostages. And when they invite me, they know that. So when I show up, I'm not going to be asked to bring a bag of money, well, right up front at least. Eventually, you usually go there. They may want to talk about, this policy concession, that policy concession. And what I can usually firmly say, at least to start off, is like, look, I'm not the policy guy. I'll carry that back. I'm here to get Americans X, Y, and Z. How can we make that happen? And at that point, you start a very interesting dance to see how you can try to generate a release. But I think being able to cut that away from the policy argument in a way is good, because I think what kind of handcuffed us in the past was someone would be taken and they would get mixed up in the policy mix, and the policy arguments can go on for years. Mm-hmm. If I can cleave something off and bring someone home on short order because I've put that distance, that might not be a bad thing. Having said that, we have one or two cases where, if you were to say a hostage case is glommed onto the policy side, okay. Another one might be to where there's a separation, and then you might have one where there's a dotted line. It might be loosely linked to a policy angle. But every case has to be evaluated on its own.
Mm-hmm. And just a reminder to everybody, if you have questions for Ali, Jason, or Ambassador Carstens, make sure to write them on your card. And our colleague is going around and collecting them. Same goes for Zoom. You can use the Q&A function there if you have a question. One of the challenges back in the day, this went through the consular offices of a given country, a U.S. consular office. This position has changed that equation. But you still have this issue, right, of not wanting to disrupt bilateral relations between the U.S. and whatever country we're talking about. How do you go about doing your job to free a particular hostage or a few of them in a given country without, frankly, if I can say it this way, pissing off the people that are trying to run the State Department operation, the embassy in that place?
Brilliant question. I think I've spent a lot of time trying to make sure that my organization is transparent and we build trust with everyone, whether it's the families, whether it's with the media, but especially with the regional folks at state. The whole idea is that if they're going to allow me to go to Syria, for example, they've got to know that I'm not going to parachute in and destroy Syrian policy or any other thing that we're trying to do. Same could go for, like, say, Venezuela or what have you.
Both of which you've visited in the last few years.
Indeed. But to do that, they have to feel like, look, the SPIHA office, they align with what the Secretary of State wants to accomplish, which is, frankly, what the President wants to accomplish. So no one wins if SPIHA goes in there and plays too much of the cowboy role and pretty much screws up U.S. foreign policy. At the end of the day, the president wants to achieve something, the secretary does, that's translated down to the regionals, and by the time we show up, our job is to align and then still find that way to bring someone home.
So back to sort of the tools that you have at your disposal, the Levinson Act certainly enhanced your toolkit, but does it do enough? Do you need more tools to accomplish what you need to do?
I think when anyone ever asks you if you need more resources, money, the answer is always yes. But actually, I'll say the Levinson Act really, they did a good job. I think we've had a chance to, I'll answer that in two ways. In terms of giving us what we need to get it done, when I joined SPIHA just 2 years ago, we had 4 people. And 3 of those people could have disappeared because they weren't written into the State Department bureaucracy. In the last 2 years, we've grown to 24 positions. We'll crest 26 here. And that's important because the workload used to be to the point where I was answering the email that hit me that second. Every day was like minute by minute by minute. Now we're to the point where we can have people really surge on a case, really take care of the families, and now we can look 3 to 6 months out, determining how we bring people home. And that came down to like actually getting, people aligned with the tasks. In terms of the tools, oddly enough, no one's really explored those. We've been at this for 4,500 years. If you don't believe me, read the Bible, read Herodotus, Thucydides, Xenophon. It's all stories about tribes and nations taking prisoners and then the drug deals that they all make to get it done as time goes on. And when someone gets a win, usually they go off and do whatever else. They don't sit there and write down lessons learned. So in this case, we're trying to be very methodical about trying to determine what tools we can use and who we can bring to the fight, as opposed to just states showing up and doing the favorite thing of the day, and that's throwing sanctions down. What else can you do in the diplomacy realm? What about the law enforcement realm? Intelligence, information. There are other tools out there that need to be explored that we can apply leverage or even give the carrots and sticks. Sometimes there's things that we could be doing to get nations to, or hostage takers to turn over who we want, and we've just not explored those tools yet. So that's kind of the hard part of the job, is that you're trying to grow and build the organization while taking care of the families, while trying to get people home, and at the same time, you want to make sure that you're exploring tools that have never been used before, and lastly, coming up with a way to deter this from happening. We win in 10 years or 15 years, however long it takes, if we come up with a prevention and deterrence strategy that raises the cost of taking hostages and wrongful detainees, that brings in allies and other partners, that eventually we can take this whole thing and put it on the dustbin of history. That's Secretary Blinken's desire, to basically work Roger Carstens and his band out of a job. And that we're trying to do that.
But you have acknowledged in the film with the Washington Post that you expect that the number of hostages held by foreign governments is likely to go up. Is there a sense that this has become business as usual for rogue regimes around the world?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, and in a way, why wouldn't it? If you're country X, and for the last 70 years or maybe 700 years, you've taken a hostage, a country, you go point to point with the Japanese, the Americans, the Canadians, the Danish, and you basically are able to sell or get policy concessions. It's a pretty good business model, frankly. And what we need to do is to get the Japanese, the Danish, the Americans, the French, and the Canadians, and everyone else to band together. And the next time someone's taken, a citizen from Botswana is taken by Iran, suddenly numerous countries are coming together on a dime and going to the Iranians to tell them that we're raising the costs of your hostage taking, and this is no longer an acceptable practice. I think the way Secretary Blinken thinks of it is if we can really establish a new norm, that maybe in 10 and 15 years we can truly put this away. Because absent ever coming up with the deterrence model, we're going to repeat this forever. And again, I'll go back to what I just said. We've been at this for 4,500 years, and we've proven to be okay at getting people returned. What we've never done in that time is establish a robust prevention and deterrence effort. 4,500 years. So if we can get there, we're hoping to make this whole problem go away.
It seems like the U.S. government theoretically has a no concessions policy, but I mean, if you ask Jason, he'll say, there's always a concession. How do you square that?
But the bottom line is we really don't want the hostage takers or the countries that are taking Americans wrongfully to get a benefit out of that. And that gets into kind of the special sauce, the creativity of trying to bring someone home, and at the end of the day, that nation state, for example, doesn't benefit greatly. And that's hard. And I can tell you in the past, you can go back to the 1960s, 70s, and 80s and pick different cases where the Americans have given in on certain areas to get people home. You can take that into the 90s and 2000s. So at times you're going to have to make hard decisions, but you're always going to have to balance that not only with the Americans we serve, but national security interests. Kind of what Rob Malley said in his piece on Jason's most excellent documentary, and that is you are balancing a lot, and at times you're going to make ugly, hard decisions to bring people back.
How did Jason's case change the game? I mean, did it create a roadmap for how to do this better? Did it maybe complicate your job because it was such a unique case that drew so much publicity? Did it perhaps encourage more of this kind of behavior?
Well, I could answer that in time. Really, I could camp out on that question for 30 minutes. So allow me just to briefly hit it. What I like about the case is that, let's say 7 or 8 years ago, if someone was taken, you might not necessarily see that on the front page of the Washington Post or the New York Times. Congress members wouldn't be, they might be interested, but they weren't together. Nowadays, I think on the things that happened in Jason's case and then moving forward, this is now a thing. If this happens, you have journalists banding together. There are probably 10 journalists, maybe more, that follow this topic, religiously. The families are starting to get to know each other and talk. So if it's a family of people held in Iran, they're now getting to know the families of folks held in Venezuela. And that's creating a different dynamic. So something that the United States government might, in a way, almost wish that wasn't happening, but I actually think that's the best thing that could happen. The more that the families and advocates, NGOs, members of Congress, I'm going to ask, and that's why I'm here in a way, I'm hoping that business community members, community leaders who are involved in sports, the entertainment industry, the more that this becomes a thing, the more it creates a positive pressure to go out and get the job done. So I would say that what we learned from the case is that it's not a bad thing to actually elevate these cases and make sure that there's a great awareness, because that, A, puts pressure on me to get the job done, and that's not a bad thing. B, it also provides, I think, a needed support to the families out there, because if you're out there by yourself, it's lonely. And I think the more that you can maybe establish those connections, the better it is for everyone.
All right, well, I'm going to pause the conversation now as we want to incorporate some questions from all of you here in the room as well as on Zoom. So for that, I would like to invite Jason and Ali Rezaian back on the stage. While they get situated and mic'd up, we're going to hear briefly from Kira Brunner-Dawn. She is the editor-in-chief of Stranger's Guide. You may have seen their Tehran edition in the lobby. It features Jason's article, Eating in Exile. Welcome, Kira.
Hi, thank you all. While they'll get them mic'd up, I'm just going to briefly speak about the magazine and a little bit about our partnership with World Affairs. As you saw in the lobby, there is the issue. We recently this year did a special issue on Tehran, which Jason was in. Hi, Jason. Also in the lobby, there's wonderful photographs from that issue, beautifully mounted in the lounge area. Take a look at those. So I'm just going to tell you briefly, we, every issue of Stranger's Guide, it's a print magazine, but also online, and every issue is a different place. And we think about it as a very different kind of travel magazine. So there's nothing about where to stay or what to eat or anything like that. It's really about place. And we have every issue, we take on that city or country or area, and then we have long form essays on that place. We have one piece of fiction, photo essays, as you can see out there, and even investigative reporting. And we really feel that what it's about is looking deeply at the way in which the country is exploring its own particular moment in time. What's most important, actually, about our mission is that 80% of all of the writers or contributors for every issue are from whatever country we're covering. And that's how we do that is we put together sort of an editorial team for each country, and they advise us and set us up and sort of introduce us to different writers and artists. And we therefore, some of them have been, well, we've had Nobel laureates, Wally Soyinka in our Lagos issue, and then we've had new up-and-coming writers. And we kind of put that together. And the reason I feel that this is a really wonderful partnership with World Affairs, and I'm really close to ending here, but it's kind of exactly what this panel is about. Right here, we've had the geopolitical look at how countries are negotiating these kinds of hostage releases, and at the same time, the intimacy of it being a family story. And how you look at those two things simultaneously is really the kind of storytelling that World Affairs is doing, and also the storytelling that we are hoping to be, that we are doing. I'm also going to just end on a little plug, which is that all members of World Affairs, you can get a discount on and a subscription, and I think something will be sent to you, or you can ask anyone out in the lobby. And I feel lucky to be here and part of this conversation. They're all set, so we're going to pass it back over.
Perfect timing. Thanks, Kira. And, thank you. There's more. I'm pleased to welcome back to the stage Ali and Jason Rezaian, along with Ambassador Roger Carstens. So we have a lot of questions to get through, so let's get started. The first question is for Ali Rezaian, and I'm sorry that I need glasses and I'm still in denial, so I might stumble a little bit as I get through this, but it says as part of, oh boy. Oh my goodness, readers. Oh my God, what a difference. Although now you guys are all really blurry. As part of, this is just, the handwriting is tough. As part of your quest to bring Jason home, you made countless media appearances making his case visible to the American public. What can average Americans all do to support the return of hostages or to help on this issue? And it's such an interesting question because your dad, thank you, was very vocal during the hostage crisis back in the late 70s and early 80s. And I think it's a great question to start with, just sort of, what can people do? Because I think there is this feeling of wanting to contribute in some way.
Yeah, I think a lot of what I did was kind of figure out how to make people pay attention. And so things like the petitions online helped once they got to a certain point. You'd be amazed what politicians will do once they hear that you've got 100,000 people that care about something, especially in Congress, right? And news organizations, right? So I think that if you're involved in a situation like this, looking at that kind of leverage, I mean, I think the situation is really different now with the group that Roger runs. But for me, it was building it from the ground up. And I think that every time I looked for a place where I could turn, put leverage on something or on somebody, I would. Whether it was politicians, creating the story, what kind of milestones do you have? Why would somebody want to cover this story on Tuesday next week? Okay, it's Jason's birthday. Okay, it's Jason's anniversary. Okay, it's 444 days. That's how long the hostages were in Tehran in '79. State Department didn't like that one, but I did it anyway, right? And I got a lot of press for it. So that's the work, and it's figuring out what people want to get your message out.
Fascinating insight. This next one is for Jason. Can you describe the feeling you had when you found out you were being released? What was most memorable about that day?
There were so many false starts in the year and a half that I was told interchangeably that I would be executed in a matter of hours, released in a matter of hours, or spend the rest of my life in that prison. So when it finally came time, it was about 10 days before I was released that my interrogator and his boss came and said, "You're being released in a prisoner swap. You're being traded for 20 Iranians, and you don't know how important you are. There are 15 lawyers in Washington, D.C. Working to free you." And I'm sitting there going, this is baloney, you know? And the first day that I was back in D.C., we went to the law firm that the Washington Post had hired, and I referenced this back, and somebody looked through the books and said, actually, there was 26 lawyers that billed hours on this case. So, but the feeling at the moment was one of relief, but also I was pretty angry because 3 or 4 days before I was released, just before the nuclear deal was being implemented, you might remember that two American naval vessels strayed into Iranian water and were detained. And those 11 or 12 service members were held on an island in Iran for less than 24 hours. And Secretary Kerry at the time picked up the phone and called Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, and by all accounts, they figured it out on the phone. Why couldn't they figure me out on the phone? So it was a mixed bag, but obviously, I was thrilled, relieved, and stepping into a brave new world.
Yeah, and there's a really interesting exchange with your interrogator, Kazem, who you should all read the book if you haven't, or listen to the podcast, because that's in both. Are we looking at a new Iran deal? This is for anybody. And if so, what does that mean for American hostages currently being held?
I'm absolutely not going to answer that one.
I figured you would not want to get anywhere near that question.
You want to take a crack at it?
I think the answer is yes. There will be a new deal. What does it mean for the folks that are over there right now? I hope it means they'll come home if that's what we get out of the deal. That'll at least be one positive thing.
All right, our next question. How do you know when you should consider a hostage exchange, Ambassador Carstens?
Boy, that's a dangerous question.
It
as
actually
well.
wasn't addressed to you, but I'm just giving it to you.
The other side usually has a vote. So when we've gone into meetings with the other side thinking that we have a sense of what they're going to ask for, and then 4 or 5 hours later walk out like, oh my gosh, I had no clue what they were really going to try to leverage us on. So a lot of it's going to come down to what the other side wants. I mean, there are things that we would never want. There are things that are uncomfortable for the United States to even consider. Prisoner swaps, that's one of them, if you want to call it a prisoner swap. We're always going to try to find something that I think the American public, Congress, everyone's going to be more comfortable with. But at the end of the day, the other side gets a vote. And if they're intent on something that's uncomfortable for us, we have to start considering it. So when do we consider things? A lot of times it's when the other side says, that they're very focused and give us very few options.
Can I add one thing to that?
Please.
I think this is why the SPIHA office is so important, because through the traditional bilateral channels, whether it's with countries that we have a relationship with or we don't, the odds of getting the guy on the other side to come clean about what he wants in a typical diplomatic setting is probably about this much, right? And I think we do a great disservice to people who are being held hostage by states by employing the typical diplomatic maneuvers, right? Yes, we want to find that person a suitable lawyer. We want to get them some books to read. We want to get them sustenance. We want to get them clean socks. All of that's very important. None of that's going to bring them home, right? And that's why what this guy does is so critical.
This next question is for Jason. What kind of care have you received to help get over this trauma? And how did the other prisoners treat you in prison after solitary confinement?
So I immediately had care at Landstuhl Regional Hospital. Is that what it's called? Yep. Yeah, it's
in Germany.
In Germany. I was flown there, and I spent, how long is this? 5 days?
4 days, 5 days.
Spent a few days getting kind of initial care, making sure I didn't have any real physical ailments, had an opportunity to do sort of an intake with psychologists. One of the government psychologists, I maintained a relationship with in those early months after my release until I got into, my own sort of therapy rhythm with a trauma therapist. And that's proven to be an essential part of my recovery, not one that everybody submits themselves to, but it was important for me. I only ever had encounters with 2 other inmates in the prison. I was held in isolation the entire time. The first one was a gentleman who was being held hostage just like me, but he happened to be from the Republic of Azerbaijan. He was a businessman who did import-export between Iran and Azerbaijan. He lived literally 2 miles over the border into Azerbaijan. He didn't speak any English or Persian. I don't speak any Azeri or Russian. Those were the 2 languages he spoke. And we spent a total of 13 months together. But I would say he became a dear friend. And sort of unbelievably, his niece and his sister moved to Washington, D.C. And they opened a bakery. And it's one of the most phenomenal and popular bakeries in Washington, D.C. right now.
You can plug it.
Yeah, it's called Sharbat. If you find yourself there, they make something called a medovev, which is a honey cake, kind of a very traditional Soviet-era thing that persists. The other guy I introduced Ambassador Carstens to was a Kurdish Iranian entrepreneur who happened to be Sunni. So, successful Sunni Kurdish is kind of 3 strikes and you're out as far as the Islamic Republic is concerned. He ended up spending 9 years in a Wien prison. His 2 younger brothers spent 7 years apiece in prison. And about a year ago, they were all out on furlough because of COVID at the same time and escaped to Erbil in Iraq. And I won't get into too many of the details, but all of them are living comfortably in the United States now. So, yeah.
This question is for Ambassador Carstens. How do foreign governments consider working with your office? Does it mean when they agree to negotiate with you that they are in fact holding the American citizens in question as hostages?
My answer would be yes. I'm sure their answer would be no. I've been very surprised to see how willing they are to talk to us. I think when I first took the job, I'm like, no one is ever going to talk to someone whose name is hostage guy. Why would you? Because in a way it is kind of implied, I guess, that you've done something wrong. And yet, interestingly enough, we've talked to a few folks. I'm just telling you stuff that's publicly available that we've acknowledged, but we've talked to, for example, the Syrians, the Venezuelans, and the Taliban. And I think at the end of the day, everyone wants to try to solve a problem. And that's part of the job, like getting with the other side and trying to figure out what's going to get the release. That's what I care about. And they obviously have things that they care about. And we have to try to take those sides and keep necking them closer and closer and closer.
Really interesting. Do the wrongfully detained have a particular profile? This could be for you, Ambassador, if you'd like to take it. E.g., dentist on vacation or former military. There are a number of former military men who've been detained.
Yeah, so I'm actually going to say that they have one thing in common that's very important. They hold a blue passport. And if you hold a blue passport, that should mean something. And if you're taken, we're going to come and get you. We're going to bring you back. And that's the one thing that they all have in common. It's hard to actually get down and neck it down to why they were there at what time. But at the end of the day, we have journalists who want to go to very tough places because they seek the truth and want to report it. We have contractors and aid workers who are trying to put humanitarian assistance into different places. We have Americans who just want to be free to travel. I know we were talking earlier about people in the Bay Area You know, there are people that want to get out, they want to travel, they want to do things and see things. We have a business community that wants to travel to some pretty tough places and try to do good things in their business environment. So Americans love to travel, and if you hold a blue passport, you should be allowed to. And if it ever goes the wrong way, if it goes south, if you're taken wrongfully, the State Department has to do its duty and bring you back.
This next question is for, thank you for that. This next question is for Jason. Tell us about your meeting with Anthony Bourdain.
Wow.
May he rest in peace.
Yeah. So that was a really consequential occurrence in my life. It happened 5 or 6 weeks before we were arrested. A lot of people assumed it was because we were on Parts Unknown that my wife and I were arrested. Nothing could be further from the truth. It had absolutely nothing to do with that or any other media appearance. To Roger's point, we were people, or I was a person who had a blue passport, happened to be working for a very high-profile organization. But, you know, we had this meal with him, you know, at a restaurant high in the hills above Tehran. As I'm sure you know, in sort of touristic areas anywhere in the world where there's a nice view, places are usually that are known for the view aren't known for the food. And I told the manager of the restaurant, I said, you know, you don't know this, but the most important person in the history of food television, and I don't know if he understood if that was a thing, right, is about to show up and eat in your restaurant. And if you don't think you can bring your A game, 3 doors up, there's a really good restaurant that I go to when I come here. You should go get food from there. And the guy was very offended. He said, no, we're very good. And the platter of kebabs came out, you know, covered in cellophane, which is never a good sign, right? And we sat there, and I was very apologetic about the poor quality of food, even though I didn't pick the place. But we had this really, you know, warm conversation, and I think that translated into the segment. We sat there with him for an hour and a half, talked about a lot of things, and when we got up, the producers, you know, said he must have really liked you guys because he never sits there for that long. And I remember sitting in my prison cell thinking, I really hope that no one convinces them not to use that segment. You know, that will be a lifeline for me if that is on television. And it turned out to be the case. And for several years, that episode of Parts Unknown was the one that had been played the most, replayed many times, in part because the Washington Post and the State Department were fine with it being played over and over again. And I think a lot of that had to do with Ali being fine with it being played over and over again. And I think it contributed to people putting a face and a personality to our case that wouldn't have existed otherwise. I couldn't just be described by, you know, his neighbors say he was a quiet man type of thing. You know what I mean?
I worked in local television for many years, so I'm very familiar.
Yeah.
Jason, how did being held hostage in Iran change your perspective of a country that you previously had identified with?
I still identify with it in some ways. I still love it very much. I lived there for 5 years before this happened to me. I'd probably still be spending a lot of time there if this hadn't happened to me. I think I'd be a real hypocrite if all of a sudden I blamed this horrible thing that happened to me on the 85 million people that live in that country. That being said, I have a different kind of commitment to the issue of other people being held hostage in Iran and in other countries. And also, you know, I have a platform and opportunity to speak out against the Iranian regime for human rights abuses, and I try not to miss any opportunity to do that.
What are some proposed or planned deterrents for taking American hostages, deterring foreign governments from taking American hostages, Ambassador?
Oh my goodness. In a way, a dangerous question because we're really starting to just explore that and some of the tools we want to almost test drive. The Canadians have done a wonderful job leading an effort that started just over 1 year ago. On February 15th of last year, not the past one, but just over a year ago, they launched a declaration where nations that were wanted to make a stand against arbitrary detention, they could come together and sign on to that.
This involves 58 different countries.
It's actually, I think it's just crested over 65 now. They might even be 68 if I'm not mistaken.
Forgive me.
But so we've been working with the Canadians to start exploring some of those tools. And so even though part of me is dying to tell you all like 2 or 3 of them, it really is because I'm interested, you'd be interested, it'd make for a great conversation. And yet I think I'm going to be prudent and not tell you what we're thinking about right now until we explore them. But again, the goal is to like find those ones that we're just not thinking of that are going to get some leverage.
And Jason, I'd love your thoughts on this really quick, because
yes.
obviously growing concern about countries doing this.
I think my attitude, and Roger and I have talked about this many times. There's 2 challenges here. There is the challenge of bringing Americans home as quickly and safely as possible, and then deterring this practice in the future. For a long time, I think most people, and including most people in government, have believed those 2 things to be mutually exclusive. They aren't mutually exclusive. They can't be. We have to figure out those kind of pressure points and levers. And my very basic thinking on this, I'm not a theoretician or a diplomat or a lawmaker or anything, but the deterrent mechanism should match the motivation, right? So if the motivation is financial, the deterrent should be financial. If the motivation is arms related, we should, take the arms away from somebody, make it more difficult for them to get things. And I think there's always a kind of call and response that happens in these instances, and you have to figure out what it is that's driving this, and then cut off those possibilities.
Can I jump on that, if I may? This is why I think it's important to partner with people like Jason, because I don't know what you think, Carol Lee, but when I walk into the State Department every day, I feel like I surrender my creativity. It's just one of those jobs where it's just part of DC. So when I come home at night, which is sadly usually about 8:30 or 9, I will call someone like Jason or friends like Eric Levinson, for example, another person that does a lot of these things, Mickey Bergman from the Richardson Center, and we'll talk about this. And in talking to them, you usually come up with the ideas, just like Jason brought up, that you're not going to be considering. More to the point, the families usually have great ideas. There was a time I was getting ready to leave, and I said, look, we're going to partner with you. You may be thinking of things that we're not thinking of, so please feel free. I started to walk away, and a young teenager says, well, I actually, never mind, it's probably really stupid. And I said, no, please, tell me what it is. He goes, well, for the last year or 2, I've been thinking about this, because their loved one had been held for a long time before we took the case. And I swear to goodness, my jaw dropped, and I'm like, that's it. That's exactly what we're going to do. And so I'm partnering with people to include, and Philip, I love what you talked about. When you first started this, you're trying to bring everyone together to start these conversations and to grow things that are new and fresh. That's why you have to partner with people, and it has to be broad. And in the conversations I've had, I remember driving home one night, and we had that exact same conversation, and it shaped what we're doing right now. So anyway, sorry, had to go there.
No, maybe the State Department should hire more teenagers. It's all just a thought. I'm just trying to do my part. Another question for the ambassador. How do you handle a situation, I'd never thought about this, when the American is a hostage who is in the wrong, who's, I guess, I'm assuming, done something wrong?
We have cases like that, where an American actually did do something wrong, but if you take a look at the Levinson criteria, they still underwent, or I'll say, they may have done something wrong. Again, innocent until proven guilty. But on the face value, or the face of it, it looks like he or she may not be in the right, but they were given a sham judicial process, so they didn't really get a chance to have a fair trial. They may have been taken in, they may have been tortured. They may have also been used as political leverage. So you can say, did they perhaps break that window with a rock as they were walking by? Well, maybe they did, but no trial, tortured, and being used for political leverage. That's my case, and I want it. So we have a few like that.
All right. Thank you for all these great questions. I sincerely appreciate it. We have time for one more. This one, it says, my husband is from Peru and is constantly worried about our children being kidnapped while we are traveling or visiting family in Peru. How is your office working to make dual nationals feel comfortable visiting family in the developing nation, which is, relevant in the case of the Namazi family, which is Siamak Namazi is being held in Iran. His dad went there and was detained himself.
I mean, you can always go to travel.state.gov and take a look at a country that you're supposed to, or that you want to go to, and we'll actually kind of give you a sense of whether that's dangerous or not, and whether you're at risk for being taken hostage or what have you. We're working on establishing fine-tuning indicators, so that if you're going to go to a country that actually has a history of turning someone into a wrongful detainee, we can also kind of attune you to that. And then I think there are also some other little tips of the trade that are put out on the website. I've looked at it. I went to looking at it thinking it was going to be an absolute waste of my time, like most government websites are. And I was pleasantly surprised that it's actually worth about 5 or 10 minutes of your time. So.
Wow, that's saying something. Ellie, you really went above and beyond. I mean, Jason very articulately lays out in the book the lengths that you went to get him, to help him be freed ultimately. Should it be this hard?
You're put in a really difficult situation. I mean, you're a normal person out of your normal life, and you're stuck in the middle of this geopolitical thing, just like Rob Malley said on the video. It's going to be difficult. Should it be that difficult? No, but it is. As I went through it, I thought all the time, other people have had to do this too. Every time I said, why me, or why am I having to do this? We know them. We've talked to them. You know, Ambassador speaks to them every single day. They're going through similar things. Jason's case was much more public, and so I probably did some things that other folks didn't have to do.
What's your best advice for families going through this?
Unfortunately, I think my best advice is to play a long game. Don't expect it to be over fast. Take care of yourself, take care of your family. Those are all things I didn't do. It took me a really long time to get to the point where I realized, what I do today, to try and get them out tomorrow, that's not what I have to do. I have to do stuff, over the course of the next week or the next month, and think 3 or 6 months ahead. I didn't want to admit that was even a possibility for 6 months. Yeah. So, and you just got to take care of yourself too. So
I want to close by asking each of you to briefly say what you're hoping that people listening will take away from this discussion. If people want to be supportive of families of hostages, former hostages, or government efforts to prevent the use of hostage diplomacy, what can they do? And Ali, let's start with you and work our way back this way.
Sure. I mean, I think every family that we talk to is on Twitter, Instagram, something talking about the problem. You can easily go online and support them that way. It meant a lot to me when I would see that. If you know these people, reaching out to them and just letting them know that you're following the case, that's important. I think that the government over the course of the last 5 years has really done a lot to make the process better. I think that's what we're hearing here today. And I think that those are the main things.
Jason?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I've tried to make myself as available as possible to families on a one-on-one level, but to echo what Ali said, really taking care of the family is super important, and I've had to learn how to make some boundaries around this. Like, I try not to do too much of this on the weekend to maintain, a healthy life balance. But I throw myself into it as much as I can the rest of the week. And to me, being as public as possible, if you're a journalist or have other public platforms, talk about the issue, talk about particular cases. Also, there are a couple of organizations, in particular, I would say the Foley Foundation, which tracks all of these cases very closely, but also a great organization called Hostage US that works very much behind the scenes with families during and after hostage situations on a very small budget, but does incredible work caring for people. So look into the work that those two organizations are doing and support them if you can.
Thanks, Jason. Ambassador?
I would say that I want people to know that I guess back in the day when Ali first did this, we had a conversation where he described, the shock that he felt when this happened, and then trying to struggle to find, like, who do I talk to in the government and how challenging that is. I think we're to the point now where we're trying to roadmap the families to decrease the amount of shock. A good example is I'm here to participate in this event, and I'm really here because we've taken 2 more cases. They're both in California, and so tomorrow I'll go spend 3 or 4 hours in the living room of one, and the next day I'll go down to Los Angeles and spend 3 or 4 hours in their living room. And while we're there, I want to hear their story. I want to connect with them. I want to tell them how we're going to work together to solve it. I want to let them know who's who in the zoo. Here's what I do. Here's what the CIA does. Here's what the Department of Defense does. Here's how we're going to all work together. And then the big thing I want to tell them is we want to partner with you. And this all came from the great work that organizations like the Foley Foundation with Diane Foley, David Bradley back in the day, what we're doing now was built on the back of giants, people who went through massive amounts of pain, and we're trying to make sure that your government is giving you a return on your investment, that if you're going through this, we're going to be there, we're going to partner, we're going to cry with you, we're going to solve this together. And if we're not doing it, hold us accountable. You have every right to stack the pressure on if we're failing.
All right, well, I want to thank all of you, Ambassador Carstens, Jason Rezaian, Ali Rezaian. Thanks to everybody who joined us on Zoom. Thanks to everyone here in this room with us. And my apologies to this side of the room because my back was to you, which is a cardinal sin in Iranian culture. And also thanks to World Affairs. We're going to close with a few words from Philip.
Great.
So this will be quick. So many thanks to Jason and Ali Rezaian for sharing your personal stories with us. It was really, really amazing. Ambassador Carstens, thank you for your passion, and to your team for what you're doing.
Thank you.
We were all very impressed. I want to thank your mom as well for being with us. Okay,
She's listening.
Not here. Is she listening?
I'll bet she must be.
Thank you so much for joining us. It was great. Okay, and then Lily, thank you for just being a wonderful host and moderator for us. I want to thank our staff for putting this all together. You've worked incredible hours, and I think this was flawless. Thank you. And then finally, I want to thank all of you who are here, and for all of you who are online and who will be viewing this a little bit later. This is so important. I want you to be with us. We had talked about, as Ambassador Carstens, you had said, ideas come from, all of you have so many things to offer, and we want to give you an opportunity to be part of something larger that we think we can all accomplish here in San Francisco and at World Affairs. So join us, okay? There's plenty of food in the backs. Please stay. We're going to be here for a while longer, probably about 8 or 9 o'clock, I think. I think 8 o'clock. There's food down at E&O, so if you want to continue the conversations there, please do. And then there is one additional call to action. You should have received an email by now, okay, that is going to ask for your comments on this evening's program. But the most important one is the last question. We want to know what you are interested in accomplishing and what kind of impact you want to have, okay? And we're going to look at those. Be on the lookout for more communications. We have a lot of interesting things that are coming down the pike, and we're looking forward to all of you joining us. And I'm sure that all of you will look forward to meeting the person that you met at this time, and you'll always remember that. So thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Oh.